Well, guys, we are in chapter 20, the Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s, the time of Prohibition, just basically a time where there are many social changes happening in the United States and in United States history. So first, we're going to look at this new clash of values and introduce you into some nativism. Nativism is basically a way of being prejudiced. After the war, prejudice grew towards Germans and communists or anything different. Immigrants were moving to America to escape the destruction of Europe. New immigrants threatened taking jobs from existing Americans. Some of the themes that you hear will echo things that you are hearing today in our politics, so just pay attention and compare them to things that you are hearing. So we're going to look at three things in this section 1, Sacco and Vanzetti, pseudoscientific racism, and the return or resurgence of the KKK. And so what we have here are two individuals that were people that were workers. They were Italians, they were anarchists that believed in overthrowing government. They disagreed when they came to the United States and saw how hard people worked and didn't feel like they were getting ahead, and that the owners of the agencies or the factories were doing better than them. That's kind of why they went into the anarchist mentality. So Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested for killing 2 employees and robbing $15,000. The problem is that there wasn't any great or amazing evidence against them, but because they had chosen anarchy and had spoken out against the government, and because the United States was in the place that it was, they kind of end up being these, I guess we could use the word patsy. They were anarchists that were sentenced to death. The newspaper publicized every detail, which caused an uproar of hate towards Italian immigrants. So Sacco and Vanzetti, like I said, is just one of those cases. Pseudoscientific racism. So that comes from a concept of eugenics, which is a false scientific idea that human inequalities were inherited and warned against breeding the unfit or inferior. So look down below where it says Indiana eugenics law, and how they believed in sterilization of certain people, and that those people will not have the right to reproduce. But it's really difficult for a government to decide who gets that right. So you can start to hear, and I'm going to use the word echo again, echoes of Nazism and what was going to be happening in Germany. So this fueled racism and hatred for the different from WASPs, and not the bug, no, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Even President Wilson supported the idea. By supporting this, people gave strength to racist theories held by organizations such as the KKK. So if you lean over to the final column here, the KKK, of course, stands for the Ku Klux Klan. And as we know, Klan is actually spelled with a C. But after the Civil War, the KKK only hated freed slaves. But by the 1920s, they broadened their hate and violence towards Jews, immigrants, and other, quote, un-American values. William J. Simmons founded the new KKK in Atlanta, Georgia in 1915, and sadly, he was a Methodist preacher. So it's always sad when those groups themselves to something like the KKK. Now, when we get to this clash of values, you'll look at the way that they go about it at the time was controlling immigration. So you can see the areas of immigration that were prominent. And if you look at that particular map right there, you can see the largest area of immigration was coming from the United Kingdom. And there's a reason why, because of course they start to put controls on the percentage of people that were allowed in. So after World War I, Americans wanted tighter control on who entered our borders. In 1921, President Harding signed the Emergency Quota Act, which established temporary limits on immigration according to ethnicities, which is your country of origin. This actually had the power to separate family members that were born in different countries, even mothers from their children. Now, some of you may call yourself Italian Americans or Irish Americans, but how far back do you even need to go to even reach that area of your life? I doubt many of you actually carry a passport from that particular country, which would actually make you an Italian American, a Greek American, a German American. So really think about that. If you were issued a passport, you would probably be issued just a regular old American passport. So then the National Origins Act of, and some call it the National Origins Quota Act of 1942 or 1924. This made the quota system permanent. 2% of each ethnicity already residing in the U.S. in 1890 was the top off. In 1929, it limited to 150,000 people per year. Northwestern European countries accounted for 87% of those coming in. Now, what's strange is that, and it seems opposite of what's happening now, is that Hispanic immigration in the United States was just fine because it was considered okay because it was all Western Hemisphere people. So 70,000 Mexican immigrants poured into the United States, fleeing the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which was what we discussed in the last chapter. 600,000 Mexicans came to the United States from 1914 to the 1920s. The National Origins Act of 1924 exempted immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, so all South and Central Americans. And then morality, we're going to look at what that is, the quality of being in accord with standards of right and good conduct, or a system of ideas of right and wrong conduct. People supported the idea that these good ideals led to a happy marriage and family. Advice books started to surge. Independence grew as women as they began to work, leave home, earning their own wages. Cars led to independence of youth that could socialize away from their parents. Again, with women, fashion changed for women drastically with the cutting of two things: hemlines, shorter skirts, and hair, the bob. They called these women flappers. She could smoke, drink, dress differently. She had social freedoms, financial independence in the form of a job. It was determined that reducing birth rates for women also increased their life expectancy. It's very, very, very hard on a female body to be pregnant and to give birth. And so if they reduce the birth rates, they reduce the chances of a female dying during the birthing process. And so this gave women freedom. And so did shortening their clothing, apparently. And the last part of this particular section 1, the fundamentalist movement and prohibition. You guys could spend a semester discussing these two things, but one of the things that we come out of this is, of course, the Scopes trial, because basically there was the fundamentalist movement that started by Lyman Stewart. He had a pamphlet named The Fundamentals. It was mostly Protestant preaching against evolution. And not microevolution, but macroevolution. Macro meaning ape to man theory of creationism, or Darwinism, as some people call it. This versus creationism or an intelligent designer. Something started everything that's here. And if something started it, something must be intelligent enough to start it. So what was before what, I guess you could say. So the Scopes trial didn't look at all of those things because, of course, man hadn't traveled very far at that point. In 1925, the Butler Act outlawed teaching evolution. So the ACLU decided to say to a biology teacher, John Scopes, hey, you want to be arrested and go on trial and be a figurehead for us? And he sacrificed his name and did that. And he was only fined $100, but it was overturned. And eventually, because of this big struggle and all that went into this, the fundamentalists lost a little bit of power with mainstream Protestants. You can look up a lot of pictures with that. You guys can look at the hide the hooch while I read this above. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. The Volstead Act to enforce the illegal sale, consumption, and distribution of alcohol. The argument was alcohol destroyed lives and families and caused crimes against women and children. After passing the law, speakeasies or secret bars, as well as moonshine or homemade alcohol, became prevalent. This made alcohol a booming illegal business for organized crime. Oh my gosh, I almost choked. But here we go. Of course, you start to have people such as Al Capone, and there's so many videos on him. He, of course, gets syphilis, becomes really stupid, and dies because with syphilis, it goes to your brain, and he didn't think to have himself checked out. And he was somebody involved in the crime world. So now we're going to go on to section 2, the cultural innovations. There are only 2 slides here. And what's sad is that this cultural innovations are separated from the Harlem Renaissance, which almost looks as if your book is dividing this between white and black culture. And that's the way that this particular book does. But during this time, you can see that there were separate areas within New York. And this is looking at Greenwich Village and the south side of New York, where artists, writers, and thinkers moved to that area. The concept of bohemian comes out, which is being artistic or unconventional. I believe we still use that title, but usually we use it as almost a fashion statement, like boho. Modern American art went from realistic, which you can see there with Edward Hopper, more to impressionistic, which you could see with Paul Cézanne and John Marin, down below on the bottom left. And there were many poets and writers, and really just too many for me to list. So I hope that your English teacher is really covering this with T.S. Eliot and Ernest Hemingway. There is just tons of people that came out of this era. And of course, what's really interesting, things that were invented in this decade, well, I'll tell you some things that weren't invented in that decade. Airplanes, U-boats or submarines, and Velcro. Just keep that in mind when you're doing your questionnaires. Next slide is looking at things that are new for us. We're listening to baseball and boxing on the radio, which jumps over to the third column, and there is Hollywood. And there are people that are pop figures now. Before it would have just been military leaders or political figures, but now we have sports heroes, Hollywood starlets, and radio and music stars. So think about it. This is the reason why is, of course, because media becomes so very prevalent. So due to the video and movies and the newsreels that took place before a person watched a movie in the theater, sports figures became heroes. Babe Ruth, who's pictured there, baseball player, the Bambino, was a large man, as you can see, and played for the Red Sox and eventually the Yankees. American League's most prolific hitter, and with his home run hitting prowess, he helped the Yankees win 7 pennants and 4 World Series titles. Then you could see some movie stars there. Clara Bow was called the It Girl because apparently she was hot stuff. So I know that these are not meeting the standards of beauty that you guys would tie to today, but that's exactly what was hot in the 20s. And then the radio. A very ugly person could be on the radio because nobody saw you. You just had to have a really good voice. Radios became popular in homes where families would gather around, like you do with the TV, to listen to soap operas, sports and adventure stories. It fostered a sense of shared national experience that unified the nation. Some popular song, Yes, We Have No Bananas, and Lover Come Back Again, and the broadcast you can see there below of Amos and Andy. And now we're on to the Harlem Renaissance, which again is just too gigantic to cover in 2 slides. You can see that Harlem is yet a different part of New York City, other than the one we were looking at with the other cultural innovations. We have Claude McKay, which you will be reading and answering questions of one of his poems in your questionnaire. He wrote a story about the lynching, and McKay was all about, he was, segregated. He was from Jamaica, and he was living in this era where people still hated you for this color of your skin. And so he just basically was teaching through poetry, rise up and don't put up with this behavior. Don't, just because your skin is this color doesn't mean that you should settle. You can also see Langston Hughes. He's from Missouri and wrote a famous writer out of Harlem. And you can see a picture of him there, and it just has, hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is barren field frozen with snow. So many interruptions, so little time. So, you can see the Cotton Club, very famous club. The Apollo Theater is another one, and you probably still hear about the Apollo Theater because it's actually still functioning. Now, when we look at jazz, blues, and the theater, Louis Armstrong and jazz. Louis Armstrong was from New Orleans. There's an entire park named after him. And he just blended music. It's kind of like when you hear people blending with rap these days and stuff. He was doing the same thing and just becoming amazingly popular. Jazz is the type of music that he brought up and fused with other musics with ragtime. And then there was Duke Ellington. You can see a picture of him. And the different things that he came up with. And then, of course, the concept of blues, a soulful style of music that evolved from African-American spirituals. Bessie Smith was a blues singer that sang about unfulfilled love, as most singers do, it seems like. And Paul Robeson was a singer and actor who was actually in the movie Showboat and appeared at the Apollo Theater. So with this resurgence also comes powerful political moves. And you have to understand that African Americans at this point had never held a political office, especially one that was on the national level. And so when we look at the black vote in the North, with the Great Migration during World War I, it changed politics in the North with the addition of powerful voting bloc of African Americans and their interests. So if everybody decides, hey, we are together, we are one, and we are going to vote for all the same things, that is huge amounts of power. And so most were Republicans like Abraham Lincoln, and Oscar DePriest, right there below, was the first African-American representative in Congress. He helped to declare Lincoln's birthday a holiday and fine and imprison officials who allowed lynchings, believe it or not. Yeah, crazy. And so if you don't know what a lynching is, we're going to get to that. The NAACP was, of course, battled against segregation and discrimination and everything going on in the South that they could because of the inequality in the Jim Crow laws. So the lynching is murder by mob, often by hanging, but also by burning at the stake or shooting. And of course, I'm not going to show a picture of this, although I think that visual history is the most moving type of history. Google it. It's up to you now. Educate yourself. Slowly, they began to gain power and are now one of the greatest political forces in America. And finally, over here is this unique character, Marcus Garvey of Jamaica. And he is just real unique guy who started this, he believed in Negro nationalism and formed the UNIA, United Negro Improvement Association. Basically, his message was, wrap your head around this, African Americans could gain economic and political power by education. Love it. Here's the part that seems so different. He actually wanted separation from whites and to settle African Americans back in Africa, specifically Liberia. Most people, like, for example, if I called myself Greek American, but I don't speak any Greek, imagine how difficult it would be for me to blend back into Greece with no language skills, no political concepts, no nothing. So, if any of you guys have Miss Johnson as a counselor, that was her. So basically, let's go back to Mr. Marcus Garvey. He lost the support of the black middle class because they were doing pretty good and they really didn't want to go back to Africa. And the FBI convicted him of mail fraud, and because he wasn't an American citizen, he was sent to Jamaica. He ends up dying in London, though, and he is actually found on money in Jamaica. He's a pretty important guy, actually. Part of the Rastafarian movement, if you can imagine. So there's our look at the Jazz Age. Hope it helps, and